Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Rashi Joshi.
And I'm Shikhar Saluja.
We are program managers with the Azure Migrate team. In this video, we are going to show you how to plan the migration of your Microsoft SQL Server deployments to Azure using Azure Migrate. Before we see it in action, let's learn about Azure Migrate and its new features. Azure Migrate provides industry-leading capabilities for every step of your migration journey. With the Discovery and Assessment tool, you can discover servers at scale, understand the installed applications and roles on these servers, and now you can also discover SQL Server instances and databases. You can identify dependencies between these servers as well. Once your discovery is done, you can leverage the assessment feature and understand the readiness for migration to Azure Virtual Machine, Azure VMware Solution, and Azure SQL as well. With the new Azure SQL assessment capability, you can understand the readiness, identify the ideal configuration, and review cost estimates of running your SQL instances on Azure. You also get guidance around which tool to use for migrating your SQL Server instances and databases. Once the discovery and assessment are completed and you've built a high-confidence migration plan, you can leverage the Azure Migrate Server Migration tool and the Azure Database Migration Service to migrate your SQL Server deployments. With Server Migration, you can migrate servers and applications to Azure Virtual Machines with near zero downtime. The best part is you can perform a test migration without impacting your production workloads before the actual migration. With Azure Database Migration Service, you can migrate your databases and server objects to Azure SQL DB or Azure SQL Managed Instance with near zero downtime. Moving on to specific details around Azure SQL assessments, I'll hand it over to Shikhar.
Thank you, Rashi. As Rashi indicated, to make it easier for our customers to also assess their data estate, we are now adding new features for unified at-scale discovery and assessment for SQL Server. Azure Migrate helps you discover SQL Server instances and databases running in your VMware environment. Once you have discovered them, you can create assessments for Azure SQL to understand what the ideal mode of deployment for your SQL instances and databases should be as you migrate them to Azure. Should it be Azure VM? Should it be Azure SQL Database? Or should it be Azure SQL Managed Instance? Now, before I get into the demo, I'll walk you through the process of discovering and assessing SQL Server instances and databases running in your VMware environment, so that you can plan their migration to Azure, leveraging Azure Migrate's discovery and assessment capabilities. We will start off by creating a project and deploying the Azure Migrate appliance in the on-premises data center. Once the appliance is up and running, it will start discovering assets running in your on-premises data center by collecting configuration and performance data of your Windows and Linux server. Additionally, it will also discover software inventory, SQL Server instances and databases, and dependency information. This information would help us create assessments before we are ready to migrate. In this video, we are going to focus on migration assessments for Azure SQL only. These assessments will help you determine readiness of your on-premises SQL deployments for Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance, recommended target SKUs, migration blockers, and estimated costs.
Let's get started. So here I'm on the Azure portal and I've browsed to the Azure Migrate overview. You can see that Azure Migrate supports various migration and assessment scenarios. Since we'll be focusing on at-scale discovery and assessment of SQL Server today, I will select Windows, Linux, and SQL Server under Migration Goals and create a project. Once I have specified the desired subscription, resource group, project name, and the desired region, I can select Create to create my project. Once the project is created, you can see that Azure Migrate Discovery and Assessment tool has already been added to my project. To begin discovering on-premises IT environment in a unified manner, I'll click on Discover. I'll continue with the default option of Discover using an appliance. I will indicate whether the source IT estate is virtualized or not. In this case, I will continue with the default selection of Yes with VMware vSphere Hypervisor, since in this case, I'm going to discover a VMware-based environment. I will then provide the name of the Azure Migrate appliance. Let's go with appliance 01 and click on Generate Key to create a key with the help of which I will register my appliance to my project. Now there are two ways in which I can deploy my Azure Migrate appliance. One, by downloading and deploying a virtual machine image in my VMware environment. Two, by choosing to download an installer and converting one of my servers into an appliance. For this demo, I've already gone ahead and deployed my appliance with the former approach. Once the appliance is deployed, the appliance configuration manager web app launches automatically. I can see that a few automated prerequisite checks around connectivity to Azure, time sync, update status, and status of installation of VMware Virtual Disk Development Kit are performed as the appliance becomes ready for further configuration. I will now enter the key that I had generated earlier and link the appliance to the project I had created. Once I have logged into Azure from my appliance server and connected my appliance to the project that I had created earlier, I will enter the credentials of the vCenter server, which manages the servers that I want to discover. I will then provide the FQDN and port information of the same vCenter. Post that, the appliance will validate the credentials that were just entered. Now, in order to identify the installed applications on my servers, including SQL Server installations, I will enter credentials to individual servers running in the VMware environment. Here I can add both domain and non-domain credentials. In this case, I'll add non-domain ones. Lastly, to connect to SQL Server instances and capture relevant configuration and performance information, I can provide either domain credentials or SQL Server credentials with sysadmin access. In this case, I'll go with the latter. I would like to call out that credentials or accounts that you enter on the appliance surface remain on your appliance surface and are never sent to Azure. Additionally, Azure Migrate automatically maps the credentials to respective servers and SQL Server instances, so one doesn't need to map them manually. Since credentials are specified now, I will initiate the discovery process. It can take up to 15 minutes to discover the servers. Note that based on the size of the target environment, it can take up to a few hours to discover SQL Server instances and databases. On the portal, I can see that over 9,324 servers were discovered and 294 of them were running one or more SQL Server instances. Azure Migrate lets you discover up to 300 SQL Server instances from a single appliance. I can use multiple appliances to discover an even larger estate. Let's look at an example. I can see that my VM SQL Test DB VM 28 has 3 instances. Going deeper, I can see their details such as their name, version, edition, count of user databases, etc. I can further go deeper into an instance and review the databases running on it. With this, we are ready to create our first assessment. Over to you, Rashi.
Thanks, Shikhar. As we have just completed the unified discovery of Windows, Linux, and SQL servers, I'll go ahead and create an Azure SQL assessment. While creating an assessment, I can specify properties for my target, assessment criteria, and pricing. I can specify the target deployment type to indicate which Azure SQL offering I would like to leverage. For this video, I'll stick with recommended to indicate that I will let Azure Migrate determine the ideal target. If I'm already inclined towards an Azure SQL offering, I can select the same. Additionally, I can indicate whether I would bring my own SQL Server license with Azure Hybrid benefit. After selecting these properties, I'll click on Next. Once I've specified the names of the assessment and the group, I will specify the servers that should be included in this assessment. This all looks good and I can now create the assessment. Within a few minutes, I'm ready to review this. I can see that we assessed 54 servers, 185 instances, and 2571 databases. I have recommendations related to the ideal target for my instances and the estimated cost of running them in Azure. Now let's look at the details of the assessment for SQL Test DB VM 28. I can see that the DMS 2014 SQL instance is not ready for Azure SQL DB and ready for Azure SQL MI. The recommended SQL target is Azure SQL MI. As you can see that all 4 databases in this instance have migration issues for migrating to Azure SQL DB. The recommended
Azure SQL MI configuration is a general purpose queue. Next, I can see that the MS SQL Server instance is ready to be migrated to Azure SQL DB and not ready to be migrated to Azure SQL Managed Instance. I can see that for migrating to Azure SQL Database, there are some warnings that need my attention. But these are non-blocking changes for migrating to Azure SQL Database. I can also see that this instance is not ready for migration to Azure SQL Managed Instance. As you can see that one of the databases has multiple log files which is not supported by Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now I'll review the performance characteristics and recommended SKU for each database. As you can see for the database TPCC, which has a relatively higher IOPS, a business critical configuration has been recommended to meet the performance needs. Now let's look at the details of the assessment for SQL Test DB VM16. In the case when an instance is ready for both Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database, as in the case with DMS 2016 SQL instance, the recommended target deployment type is Azure SQL MI. As this instance demands high IOPS and throughput, the Azure SQL configuration recommended to me is a business critical Gen 5 SKU. The recommendation details panel shows how the ideal target was determined. In this case, the cost of running this instance on Azure SQL MI is estimated to be lower, and hence Azure Migrate provides that as the recommended target. Going back to readiness, I can see that the MS SQL Server instance is not ready for either Azure SQL DB or Azure SQL MI, and the recommended target deployment type is Azure Virtual Machine. I can review the compute and storage cost distribution for migrating to Azure SQL DB or Azure SQL MI. I can customize different offers, reserved instances, and hybrid benefits in the assessment properties to see how the cost varies and choose the combination that works the best for me. I can also create a targeted assessment by changing the target deployment type as Azure SQL DB or Azure SQL MI from assessment properties and see how the recommendations change for a particular target.
So this demo covers everything that we've added in Azure Migrate to help you discover and assess your SQL Server instances and databases at scale. We've included configuration and performance discovery, Azure SQL target and right size SKU recommendations, and also cost details to make it easier for you to start prioritizing your infra and data assessments with Azure Migrate. As you get started, you can leverage the resources on the screen such as the Azure Migrate documentation. Thank you for watching this video.